Yeah, first of all, guys, I want to welcome our guest, Amy Klevinsky. She's been one of our contributors with the Bureau of Governmental Research, Stephen Stewart. Amy's the CEO and president of BGR. Stephen Stewart, the vice president, research director, and Paul Rue. Paul Rue. Yeah, Paul Rue is a research analyst and on tax and budget issues. Guys, if you don't mind, I'll start with Ms. Klevinsky. First of all, welcome back to the Good Morning Show. Thank you guys for what you do as I think one of the lead independent organizations in the state, especially here in New Orleans, that takes a look at budgeting, taxing, not only how it affects the government, but how it affects our citizens. If there's anyone out there who doesn't know what the BGR is, Amy, give them an idea of what the BGR is, what its role is, and what its mission is.
Okay, great. So BGR is a private, nonprofit, independent research organization. We are dedicated to informed public policy and the effective use of public resources. We cover the greater New Orleans metropolitan area. That is, in fact, our mission. In practice, we are a public policy research organization. We monitor over 70 local government entities. We also monitor the state legislature for issues of local importance. That is for the purpose of identifying critical issues that need to be elevated on the public's dashboard, elevated to our research work plan where we apply independent, objective research and rigor to formulate solutions. And the goal is to move the needle toward more effective local government, better outcomes for citizens. And
let me also commend your team, Stephen and Paul, as well as your board, on this new report, which is called Look Back to Plan Ahead. I think it's extremely important. I don't know if we've had this type of analyzation in the past, but I think people have always wanted to know, well, okay, how, these budgets in the past, how do they affect us now? Why are these increases? Why do we see more? Sometimes why do we see less? How do you have a bigger budget with fewer people? And I think with this, you guys attempted to answer some of those questions as well as to determine what are the top priorities for budgeting as we move forward.
That's right. So this report is really an outgrowth of a body of work that has existed at BGR long before I arrived, but has been very active recently, where we're looking at local tax revenue at the parish level. We looked at the hotel tax structure, and now we've looked at the general fund revenues and expenditures, and it's really for the purpose of providing objective context for budgeting discussions. So we consider this a foundational piece that's going to apply to many of the conversations that are about to occur around the budget that's going to be proposed.
Stephen, it seems like this should have been something that probably should have been standard operating procedure, not just with your organization, but within government and government agencies itself. Why hasn't it been?
Well, the budget itself has changed a lot over the past several years.
Especially post-Katrina.
Post-Katrina. The city has been undergoing many changes in terms of its tax base, its retail offerings. There's a lot more retail in the city, so sales taxes have gone up. Hotel taxes have changed as well as that area has
tax
expanded.
revenues increased by $117 million.
Right. Right. So there's been a lot of changes, and I think not really much in the way of going back and looking at those changes to see how they have affected the city budget and where those dollars have gone.
And this is an attempt to do that.
That's right.
Paul Rio, the research analyst in tax and budget issues, I think, and that's part of the conversation we've had here on the show, right? Some of the frustrations from the citizens is that you see this press conference, right? We had the biggest Essence Festival ever. We broke these records. We brought in this many $1 million. Sugar Bowl, the national championship game broke last 10 records we had the biggest Mardi Gras ever. We've increased this, we're bringing in more money than ever. This kind of helps explain that in its relationship to the budget and how it affects the citizens.
That's right. There has been substantial revenue growth over the last 10 years, averaging about 5%. That's 3 times the rate of inflation. But, of course, you also have to keep in mind, the first year, 2010, we were talking about possible municipal bankruptcy at that time. So certainly additional revenues were needed to kind of stabilize the budget picture. And so there's also been a lot of substantial new costs, like the reforms at the parish jail. That's $25 million additional dollars. And so There's definitely a need for additional revenue, and what we've tried to show, though, in this report is where it has gone, so the public can kind of assess that. Was that the top priority, and can we use that information going forward to plan for the future?
Then, guys, the public right now is all over this money question. I mean, I'm talking about from the barber shop to the beauty shop, to guys hanging around on the corner, to folk looking at their tax bills, from the quadrennial assessment to this whole question about fair share and infrastructure. I don't think there could have been better timing, Mr. Levinsky, for a study like this.
So I appreciate that observation. We worked really hard to deliver this report to the public and to policymakers in advance of the budget discussions, so that it could serve the purpose of providing objective information as we talk about next year's budget.
And they're about to head into those budget.
That's right.
But I think the budget process is about to start now.
That's right. I think it starts this week. It's also very important to the BGR conversation that we've been trying to launch into the public domain. And we've consistently said that before policymakers ask citizens for more money, it's important,
you know where I'm going.
It's important to understand whether existing revenues are being optimally deployed. And that conversation can only go as far as the transparency around it allows. So part of the purpose of this report is to provide that transparency in furtherance of that conversation. We don't ultimately make or suggest the outcomes that it's incumbent upon the policymakers to decide, but we certainly are assisting with allowing them and the public to understand the facts that should inform those decisions.
For our listening audience, we're going to have this discussion before we open it up for questions in the second half hour. But it's an extremely important question. Your questions about the budget, the budgeting process, taxing. You want to give us a call. These folk have dedicated their lives to this issue, not only understanding it, but talking about the budgeting priorities and how your money is best used to fund critical agencies and critical departments. 504-260-9265. Paul, in one of your charts, and I mentioned it earlier, especially growth for the last 10 years, right? Or even if you go back to Katrina, questions we get from citizens is that, inflation shouldn't be that much, right? The budget shouldn't grow that much from inflation. I think you actually analyze that in your chart, and you consider inflation and then the increase on top of the inflation.
That's right.
Explain that to our listening audience.
Right. All of our report covers the years from 2010 to 2019. And so to factor in inflation, we converted all dollars to 2019 dollars. And so inflation is built into all the charts and graphs that we use. And so from the big picture perspective, revenue in 2010 was $538 million in 2019 dollars. And this year it's $716 million. So there's that growth we talked about earlier, an average of 5% or three times the rate of inflation.
So as someone who's not a financial analyst, if I say three times the rate of inflation, what does that mean?
Well, the value of a dollar is decreasing over time, but you're getting more dollars than you're losing if you're outpacing inflation. And that, again, we were careful to not suggest that the revenue should have held the line at inflation.
And I know we're trying to walk a fine line, but I'm just trying to address a lot of the concerns of the citizens, especially given how front and center those conversations are today. We have the mayor fighting for more money for our community. We have people not understanding why their assessments and tax increases and millage increases, and it's just, people are trying to figure this piece out, and I think you guys are helping us figure. We're not trying to blame anyone, but so folk can have a better understanding of how this process works, because those are the questions that they ask in meetings. Those are the questions that they ask here on the show. So, in doing this study, did we find that the increase was above and beyond what inflation was?
That's correct.
Right.
And so one of the key recommendations we have in the report is, going forward, if revenues continue to grow at a strong rate, to sort of capture some of that growth, harness it, and put it towards our top priorities. And we don't weigh in on what those should be. That's something for the community to decide. But
we have a general question about budgeting that we ask here, and it started with the governor. And folk have called and said, because the governor said he thought they needed a constitutional convention again to determine how we tax, how we raise revenue, how we get rid of certain mandates. Does the state even have a question of what its baseline funding to deliver critical mandated service should be? Well, that same question was asked by someone who called, well, does the city really know? So what is its bottom line, right? Especially to deliver those chartered or those constitutional services that have to happen. Do we know what that baseline or that bottom line is?
I think this is going to be a joint answer between Stephen and me, but right. In the first instance, I would say there's not sort of a certain baseline, but there is a limitation on what can be spent.
What do you mean by limitation?
So you've got revenue sources and what they yield,
right.
And then you combine that with the question of what is the local taxing capacity, what is the taxpayer tolerance, because that effectively is your ceiling. So your ability to operate.
Amy, I got to stop you there because that is a profound piece, and I think for our listening audience, it's too important to gloss over. And I've never quite heard someone put it like that, but I think you're right. How does budget consider what the taxpayer tolerance level is? Explain that in kind of layman terms, because I think that's a very, very important statement.
So consider our current circumstances where we, as voters in Orleans Parish, are about to be asked to vote on a series of propositions, one of which is 3 mills, a new tax.
Right.
The outcome remains uncertain right now and will be determined by the voters' will when they go vote. It's being considered in the context of what's on the ballot there. Taxpayer tolerance speaks to when voters speak at the polls, are they willing to absorb a new cost? A critical recommendation that we've been making now for a very long time is that voters should be afforded the convenience of understanding the full fiscal picture when they go to the polls. So a long-term financial plan that puts everything on the table, where the administration says, this is our priorities for the next horizon, let's say 2 years. Here's how we intend to fund them. These are the asks we're going to make of you. So you can actually, as a voter, make your decision holistically and not in a vacuum. You can decide which areas you intend at the ballot box to vote for. Taxpayer tolerance speaks to the willingness to fund more.
I think that's a very good definition. In one of the charts, and guys, just kind of jump in. I think this is a very profound, important piece, and I would recommend for everyone out there in the public, I would think that many of our educational institutions should probably want to share this information to begin to prepare and educate the public about what I think is a real good look at what funding was and what it is, and what I think you guys have said what it ought to be based on taxpayer tolerance. And 504-260-9265, we'll open up the lines after this discussion. In reading the report, it says the $1 billion question revisited. What is the $1 billion question?
Well, the $1 billion question is a report that we did a few years ago that tries to paint the picture of all local taxes in Orleans Parish. So everything that goes to the city, the school board, the levy districts, and all the other taxing bodies in the parish.
And that's important. I want you to break, because though the city budget may have represented $538 million and now $716, which represented in terms of our taxing revenue collected is over $1 billion.
Right. So the city's piece is is probably the biggest piece of the $1 billion.
About $1.2 billion roughly.
Right now it's right. So today it's grown over the past 5 years, grown from $1 billion to $1.25 billion in the parish. And again, there's a lot of the same factors that drove the city's revenue growth have also driven the growth of other taxing bodies. Greater property tax greater property tax base, more revenue from sales taxes and hotel taxes.
It's important to point out that the city, of course, doesn't control all of those $1.25 billion.
Yeah, you have other recipients.
And so our current report then looks just at the revenues the city itself has full control over and can reallocate as it sees fit to meet its top priorities.
Guys, we should have had a class on this report because it's definitely important, and you guys are touching on a lot of things that especially our listening audience talks about. Now, in one of the charts, you talk about the fund balance. The City of New Orleans year-end general fund reserves compared to their targeted level. There have been times we didn't have a fund balance. There have been times when we needed to have a fund balance, and we know when you talk about emergency situations, it's critical that especially a government agency have a fund balance. In looking at this piece, what should the fund balance be based on the budget, and how important is the fund balance to make sure that there is an active fund balance that they have money where money is allocated to?
Right. So there's a best practice that suggests that the fund balance should be 17% of recurring revenues. The city has a self-imposed target of 10% of recurring revenues. One of the significant findings of the report, sort of the benefit of this retrospective, is that we now see that while we had made some significant progress in accumulating a general fund reserve in more recent years, we've had trouble sustaining it and meeting the 10% goal. Part of the reason for that is one-time revenues that should go to capital or general fund reserve purposes have been more frequently used for recurring expenses. That is not a good practice. Recurring expenses should be met with recurring revenues.
And I think we all know that discussion was prominent with the Gingell administration in terms of using one-time funds in areas that should be recurring, Paul.
Right, yeah. Two recent incidences of that were the roughly $30 million for the BP settlement and $30 million for the World Trade Center project. And, the city applied the World Trade Center money to help fund police raises in the near term with the idea that general fund revenues would grow to the point where you could then cover it going forward.
Hoping that it would grow.
Yeah, right.
Moving forward.
But
those pay raises have to still be implemented each year.
That's correct.
And for our listening audience, if you're listening, that's the BGR would not have recommended that practice. In taking a look at the past, and I'm not asking you guys have we become more progressive in terms of how the city is budgeting? Is it are they using best practices a lot more? We've had all these terms thrown out like zero-based budgeting, total quality management, all of these new wave terms that politicians use when they're running for office. What type of budgeting formula or practice are we applying to government now? Or is it, as one politician I used to know used to say, willy-nilly?
So we have shifted from budgeting for outcomes under the prior administration to zero-based budgeting. It's fair to say that our report did not assess sort of the how well the budgeting methodology is being applied. So I can't sort of I can't rate the practice, if that makes sense.
But the theory makes sense. If it's just what's going to happen in practice. The zero-based theory is you start each year at zero.
Everyone starts at zero.
And it's not just making incremental little changes, a little more for police, a little less for this department. It's you start at zero. What worked last year? What's been working? We'll keep that. It's not deciding what to cut. It's what do you keep? And so you justify every dollar, theoretically. And so, the administration is piloting that with 5 departments, 5 of the larger departments. And so we'll see, Thursday, when the budget's scheduled to be released, what sort of outcomes.
In terms of, in prior administration budgeting for outcomes, explain that to our listening audience, that you set up your budget based on what you wanted to do and what you wanted to accomplish.
Right. Which services you want to provide. What does the community, they would hold public hearings, find out what people want their government to do for them, and then structure budgets for the various departments around that. They would actually, various departments would make proposals like, we can address this need by doing this at this cost. And then the council and the mayor would select items to include in the budget.
And I can't remember the organization, but they come on our show, Lee, Keith Twitchell and the young lady who the budgeting game.
It's CBNO.
Yeah, yeah, Committee for a Better New Orleans. They take how their recommendations. Did you take a look at what they recommend versus what the city funds, especially since the citizens participate in that budget game in putting together a budget?
So that budget game allows citizens and CBNO and policymakers to understand sort of what citizen priorities are. We at BGR have taken the position that the determination of priorities, that is within policymaker discretion pursuant to the appropriate process that has citizen. It's not a game that has citizen intake. So we are not seeking to establish the priorities themselves. We are seeking to bring transparency to what are the implied priorities based on the budgeting that has occurred over the past 10 years.
Paul, you mentioned the fact that we've brought more retail back into the city, and I don't think anybody had ever had a number put on it, but to the tune of tax increases in terms of $117 million more. How significant is that?
That's extremely significant. That's about 2/3 of the revenue increase. It's close to half sales tax and half property tax is where that revenue is coming from.
Now, is a lot of that attributed to these events that are booming, or is that just part of the study that analyzes what's collected in general and overall? Because we're hearing time and time again, one of the citizens' biggest frustration is to hear that we had the biggest, most successful event, but I need you to, the fines and fees are higher. We just had the largest Mardi Gras, but you're not getting a tax break or tax cut. I'm asking you for more. The city's having trouble raising revenue, but we just broke a record for an event. I'm not trying to frustrate.
No, it's a good question. So part of what the audience should understand about our report is there is so much information in here that many areas themselves could then warrant a subsequent report to drill down. So, for example, Paul, all of the sources of sales taxes. We certainly understand what the growth was, but we don't provide all the underlying detail in terms of the specific origin of each category that yielded or contributed to the growth.
Right, but the city that's one area they have excelled at in little ways and in some bigger ways is generating new revenues.
And I think that's important. I think the last administration, when you look at some of the retail that was brought back in Carrollton, Mid-City, in certain areas, the increase of shopping corridors, I think folk need to understand that, Stephen, and that was an effort where your government worked with private industry to make a difference.
That's right. The city, New Orleans Business Alliance, and other groups went out and did a lot of recruiting of stores and retail investment in the city that helped that process along.
Guys, we're going to take a break. We're going to continue to look at this, I think, very profound, important report. And I would recommend that everybody listening out there get a copy of it, especially if you're involved in education or probably neighborhood organization. You want to take a look at what your revenue was, is, and potentially can be, and how it's spent. The BGR has taken that critical look for us. When we come back, the lines will be open, 504-260-9265. I know y'all have more questions and probably better questions than I have. We'll be back after the break.
You're listening to The Good Morning Show with Oliver O.T. Thomas.
We're back. Welcome back to the Good Morning Show, 9:32 a.m. in the morning. OT, the early bird, entire WBOK listening audience. Man, we want to thank our previous guests, everyone who called in early. We want to thank Dred Scott and Kelly Livers. Thank you guys so much for doing the work as a filmmaker, as an artist, to reenact one of the most important moments in history, the Slave Rebellion, the reenactment of 1811. It's going to happen again here in New Orleans on November the 8th and 9th. They're looking for volunteers. It was the largest uprising of fight for freedom in the history of this country, and it happened right here in the Gulf South, right here in New Orleans. So contact Dred Scott, contact Livers to be part of this historic reenactment. In the studio with us right now, our contributors, Amy Glavinsky, Stephen Stewart, Paul Rue, the Bureau of Governmental Research, analyzing past New Orleans budgets to guide funding priorities. Amy, let's go over some of the most profound impacts in some of the areas that have had the greatest area of significance in the budget. And then I want to get with Paul and to Stephen or Paul and look at department by department with some of the changes, whether there's increases and decreases.
Yeah, so some of the key big picture takeaways that really, as we concluded our research and sort of aggregated all of the findings, there were some lessons to be learned. And I would say three of the...
And what did we learn?
So three of the significant ones are, the city government has demonstrated the ability historically to confront and absorb very significant new expenditures within the context of existing revenues. So when you look at consent decrees for the jail and police and then the firefighters,
we don't have the money.
Pension system issues, our look back showed us that while it had at first seemed like it was an impossible hurdle to overcome, ultimately city government was able to include it in the budget in the context of existing revenues. So I would say that's the first big important lesson. It may seem like it's impossible at first, but there's been a demonstrated ability to do it. And then once it's done, year over year, recurring revenues, it becomes a recurring expenditure, and it's addressed with recurring revenues.
I want to stay with number one first, because one of the most talked about was when we heard, man, no way we can do it. How are we going to? And that was the fireman's pension. I think the lawsuit that was lost. We saw a very painful public discussion with the mayor and the council. How in the world are we going to make that happen? It was passed from one administration to the next, but it was done.
That's right.
And it was absorbed successfully within the budget.
That's right. It was done. And similar scenarios with both the NOPD and the jail consent decrees, those seemed like insurmountable new expenditures, and ultimately they were achieved.
And then secondly, guys, 504-260-9265. This is about your budget, about your taxes. Secondly, Ms. Glavinsky, what you're saying is that once it was absorbed, then the city managed to make sure that money, that fund, was there year to year. It was part of the budget process.
Right. It became built into the budget. That's not to say it doesn't warrant annual scrutiny year over year, but it becomes a recurring expenditure that's considered in the context of the budget annually and doesn't then come across as this highly significant, insurmountable new cost.
So table number 7, what Paul provided, what I think is a good look at budgeting and outcomes and changes for the various departments. Man, it's real interesting when you look at it. Of course, we're leading off with the New Orleans Police Department, 22% increase in the last 9-10 years.
That's right. What the chart shows, it's really. The city had spent about $125 million more after taking inflation into account. And it's kind of like just shows, well, where did that money go? And so at the top of the list, $32 million of that went to the police department. And that's the most, but it also, you have to take into account this New Orleans, the police department is by far the largest department within the city's budget, and so it really only had an average increase on a percentage basis.
But people would think that, especially the way we talk about law enforcement and the need for officers and those officer pay raises, if I hadn't seen this chart, I would have thought that it represented a bigger increase than that.
That's right. Well, early on in the decade, again, remember we're looking at 2010 to 2019, spending on the police department actually decreased. With the hiring freeze was in place, and it's only within the last few years where it has started to increase again with the police raises to improve retention and recruitment, help build the force back up.
Amy had mentioned the consent decree for police and for fire and for the jail, and I'm looking here in the budgeting line item that the change for the sheriff's department was 99%. What does that represent?
It doubled, and that was virtually all of that.
Why?
Yeah, it's for the consent decree to maintain a constitutional jail, and that was a lot of different reforms in terms of supervision of inmates, and a big one was medical care. And so that all came due in 2015 when the city, the court ordered the city to pay an additional roughly about $25 million in 1 year's time. And at that time, the budget grew by close to $60 million. And so that's, they were able to find the money within the existing budget. And then, of course, in subsequent years, the recurring nature of those revenues, they were able to handle it. And so that's something we're looking at going forward. Again, I mentioned it earlier,
right,
to develop a plan for allocating some portion of future growth to important needs.
And that was going to be my next question. For our listening audience, I think please pay attention to this part of the discussion. If we say we had a $117 million increase, so we had a windfall, right? Revenue grew, tax collections grew. Now, there are other recipients' bodies where that money has to be divvied up beyond, right? The $117 million, did that just go to the city, or is that divided up between the different tax recipient bodies?
That's just the city.
That's
the city's portion.
So the city got $117 million more dollars. But what you guys are saying is, what is the plan for prioritizing in the departments and agencies in terms of how you take advantage of that new money?
That's right. I mean, there's a potential to do similar to what they did with the jail funding. Whether it be drainage, streets, maintenance, those sorts of needs. Identify what they are. We're not trying to tell anyone what those should be, but we are trying to identify a process by which we can deploy the existing resources in a way that helps meet some of these
well, I think that's profound, because especially given the discussions we have here, if you collect $117 million more than you had budgeted or thought, then maybe that money could have gone into infrastructure, or buying some new pumps or stuff that works. Let's go to the lines right now. 504-260-9265. Line number one, David. You're on with Paul Roos, Stephen Stewart, and Amy Glavinsky of the BGR.
Good morning. And forgive me if I ask questions that you already answered. I'm just catching the conversation. As I travel to the local McDonald's here, I see more, and just this week, I see more sewage and water board employees actually working on projects. I see more public works actually working on streets than I've seen in the entire 8 years of the last administration. So I'm curious, and I understand that maybe the money was part of this billions of dollars that the last administration was sitting on for whatever reason. But as far as regular revenue, okay, what the citizens are wondering is, and I'm wondering as far as your report, does it detail these regular sources of revenue, such as far as sewage and water board and Entergy, the revenue they take in, right? Because that money isn't spent every day on residents, power lines and things like that. So if we don't see workers, particularly with sewage and water board, for 8 years on the streets, does it detail where the money was spent, particularly on salaries across the board, from top down? Does your report talk about the revenues coming in and how much and who was that spent on as far as salaries? Because we don't see workers. We have to wonder, where's the revenue for the sewage and water board going?
Thank you.
If it's not going for infrastructure and you don't see any regular, everyday, hourly workers on the street, where is the money going?
Thank you. We'll let him ask that question, David. Thank you. But I think we could also apply that to the police department. If the police department getting more money, why don't we see more officers, right? If the law department is getting more money, why don't we see more attorneys?
So these are precisely the kinds of questions that
Good question, Dave.
we hope the report will prompt citizens and policymakers to consider. For each of these questions, it warrants an additional analysis, an additional report. So as I mentioned earlier, this report that we just released, a look back to plan ahead, is a foundational document where we provide top-line analysis on all of the departments, the revenues, the revenue growth, the expenditures, but we're not able to drill down on each one. For those that are elevated to a point of concern or they're raising more questions than pre-existed our report, we encourage the additional scrutiny that comes from that.
Is the Sewage and Water Board included in this report?
Sewage and Water Board is not included in this report because they're not part of the general fund expenditures, and Stephen can speak well to this.
Yeah.
Right. The Sewage and Water Board is separately budgeted for. Right. They have their own water and sewer rates and drainage taxes, so they're not part of our report. We did talk about street maintenance, which is part of the city budget.
Yeah, and actually, guys, as I'm looking at Public Works, there was a 27% decrease in budgeting to what they used to call the old streets department.
Well, we would clarify that with the report we broke out the two parts of Public Works separately.
Okay.
The streets part had a small increase during the period, the actual maintenance on the city's drainage and streets. The other aspect of Public Works we broke out separately that experienced a decrease. The street maintenance funding is something that we've written about a lot over the years. The city has made an estimate that they need about $30 to $35 million a year to do real preventive maintenance on streets. Right now in 2019, I believe we're at about $5 million of recurring dollars in the general fund. So that's one area where
it doesn't meet the need.
It doesn't meet the need.
Right.
And moreover, the city's own estimate is every dollar invested in preventive maintenance saves $4 or $5 in major repairs or reconstruction down the road. So,
and one follow-up observation. Years ago, BGR made the recommendation that street-related fees and fines, the growth in those revenue sources, should be captured and dedicated or put towards street maintenance. Had that happened when BGR made the recommendation, this $30 to $35 million need would be covered, right? And instead, here we are all these years later still trying to figure out how to accomplish it.
I remember Janet Howard specifically fighting to make sure that when more money was realized, that it was dedicated in critical areas of need. So I think we've learned a real lesson. I think that's how profound this report is. It's giving us an opportunity to not only to go back and capture some of those old practices that were recommended, but actually to apply them moving forward, especially given how fragile the budget is and people's finances are. Another hot topic of discussion in this community, parking and traffic cameras. 142% increase in the parking and traffic camera enforcement.
That's right. The city has, in the last few years, expanded the traffic camera network, and a few years ago it also raised parking meter rates and extended the hours, and so that did generate additional revenue.
How much did it generate?
Well, it's now up to, all of the street-related fines.
If you invest 142% in something, you would hope that it would generate more.
But there's another side to this discussion that has to do with the enforcement costs.
Right, that's what we're talking about.
Okay.
These are the costs, and they're actually growing at a considerably faster rate than the revenue. So, the costs of processing the traffic camera tickets and whatnot, it's not, for every dollar in new revenue, you're not getting a net increase of $1.
Well, that's a critical, and look, and I'll mention it here because if the cost for processing has gone up, that means the contractor who has the contract is making more money. They're getting paid a whole lot more to process it. And less is going into enforcement.
That's
a
going to
good
be
question.
one of the
It's a question.
It's a question that the city council ought to be asking. It's a question that our council members ought to be asking. And I think this is this is why this report is so important. You have 142% increase, right? but the citizens aren't realizing better enforcement. The person who has the contract is making more money.
We did note in the report, we did find in the report that from 2010 to 2019.
You guys are good. No, y'all are very good.
Okay. Thanks. We found in the report that from
Stephen Stewart. Go ahead, Steve.
2010 to 2019, the enforcement costs actually grew at a faster rate than the new revenue from these parking fines and fees. So when you look at the overall net, there was a very limited net growth over the 10-year period. So looking at the factors that are driving enforcement costs is a real area of inquiry for the council and others in the city budget process.
I'm looking at an area of growth here that just because it's so enormous, it is the Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness, 788% increase. Well, I understand globally terrorism. We're afraid if somebody it looks different and they walk in a public building today. But 788% increase there. That's a pretty big one.
Yeah. So there were a couple of instances where we, noted consistent with the sort of the big picture lessons learned that we were talking about at the opening of this segment, where the city government demonstrated a commitment to increase funding, sort of political will or the administration's priority and the ability to do it. Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness is an example of one of those instances where there was a commitment to increase funding and then the correlating ability to do it.
Part of that
within existing revenues. Yes.
And part of that is the new command center to monitor the video surveillance feeds. That's a big chunk of that.
I'd like you guys, we can go, there's some really interesting things in this report, but I'd like you guys to explain something that kind of comes to mind based on discussions we've had about the budget. The impact from one administration to the next in terms of budgeting, right? And the budgeting priorities and principles they use, and the impact that they have or potentially have on the next administration in terms of those practices that were applied. Have we seen some consistency there, or has it changed from one administration, one council, one mayor to the next?
Well, I think in our 10-year review, we definitely noted that public safety was by far the biggest priority, and that was consistent over the course of the 10-year period. And that includes the police, the jail, fire protection, and homeland security.
So there's consistency in those areas.
Right. And then when you get down to the other categories, you did see some new dollars put toward other services such as parks and recreation. Health and human services also received an increase. So those are examples of places where the city, with some of the extra dollars it had, made decisions on new priorities or things that they could increase during the time.
We have a question that was texted me from one of our listeners, Amy, who said, when you mentioned you're looking at kind of like the holistic approach to budgeting priorities, but you didn't get into the details. So the question from the person who's listening is there a plan at some point to get into the more detailed aspect of what your findings are?
A plan for BGR to get into more detail. There's the possibility. So the way we work is our bodies of work build on one another. And this is our latest installment. We have not sort of regrouped after this to understand which specific area it suggests and we have capacity for to drill down deeper. If you look back at the continuum of our work, generally we do pick up on significant items in furtherance of those. But at this moment, we have not yet determined that work plan. If the listener is speaking to the budgeting process, we recommend this long-term financial plan for the city, which would arguably include drilling down into some of these areas and importantly stop this piecemeal approach to taxation
and when you
mention
when you mention piecemeal approach for our listening audience, explain that in terms of how budgeting should be or best practices in budgeting.
So when I used it just now, it was sort of in the context of considering and asking citizens to consider sort of in a vacuum or in isolation specific proposals,
initiatives, yeah.
as opposed to understanding how those work as pieces to a larger comprehensive picture for the city budget. And there's a sort of a shorter term component of that, which is what's on the horizon in the near term, the sort of 2 to 3 years that I mentioned earlier. And then there's the longer term, which is 20 to 30 years. What's our plan for the city? How do we intend? What are the priorities that are identified, and how do we intend to pay for them? Because if policymakers and citizens understood that, the decisions that can flow from it could be more effective.
But Paul, in the work that you have done, in the research that you have done in the areas, of course, increased sales tax collection, we know that we've brought more retail back. We look at the tourism dollars. The next survey, they're going to break the record of the last survey that was done by 8 million. I think there's going to be 18 million visitors. It was 10 million last time, 12 million overnight, 6 million day stays. So you're painting a picture of growth, actually more money coming into the parish, the city collecting more money. So what do you say to our citizens out there in terms of the budget picture moving forward based on your study?
Well, just to
you've painted a pretty big picture in terms of growth and collection.
That's correct. Yeah, and again, it's just the idea of this longer term plan. I mean, we can't stress that enough. To when we talk to some of the city administrators about in preparing this report, they learned something from it, because they've tended to be so focused on just this year's budget, the upcoming budget, and not really looking at the trend and seeing the change over time. And I think that's pretty powerful. And so we have quite a number of charts in here showing the change for every department. And so you really got to sit down with it and to really absorb the information. It's kind of there's not really a great big headline to it, but on the whole, if you look at it, you can glean a lot, I think.
So I would add to this that if you look at this report, this work, its conclusions and takeaways, I would say that there's sort of cause for optimism, or the belief that we can accomplish budget goals. We have, when they've been significant. We have experienced significant positive revenue growth. The future projections are more tempered than some of the success that we had over the past decade, but there's still projected growth. And so I would say that this report demonstrates the remarkable ability to get a lot done within the context of existing revenues, and we need to consider thinking that way. We can do it. How can we do it? BGR has laid out some ways. There are conversations to be had, but let's start deliberately and intentionally planning for effective outcomes that are achieved as efficiently as possible. That's the conversation we need to be having.
And should we revisit the recommendations that the BGR has made in the past when you see growth in areas, dedicating that money to critical needs or critical agencies?
Yeah. Harness revenue growth is how we like to say
and what do you call, what's the term?
Harness revenue growth, right. So where revenue growth is occurring, understand what it is and allocate it to either existing underfunded priorities or new priorities that have emerged before going out and saying we need more.
First of all, guys, for our listening audience, get a copy of this report. There are some areas where there was a 7,017% increase. No, I'm not misquoting. 7,017% increase. There's another area where there's a 108% increase. There's another area where there was 110 and 136% increase. And in some areas, juvenile court, there was a decrease. And in vehicle maintenance, critical areas of maintenance, and there was a decrease. In sanitation, there was a decrease. So in debt service, there was a decrease. So get a copy of this report. How can folk get a copy?
So our website is bgr.org, and we have this report and many others. All of the reports that we reference inside of this one are likewise available. There's a significant body of work that we host on our website.
Now, for all those folks who are listening out there, man, Dave, thank you for calling. That was a very good question. Y'all going to be calling me now. Y'all had a chance to call in and talk to the professionals and the experts who do this. But Stephen, Paul, anything y'all want to add before we end this segment?
Well, we think looking forward to the budget discussion this fall. I mean, one of the issues that is going to factor into setting priorities is this topic of how do you keep paying for the police raises now that the one-time money has kind of run its course.
Right.
And so looking at the potential of the budget, what kind of revenue growth can we expect next year, and then how does that play into discussions of setting tax rates for next year? That's all going to be important discussion to have.
Paul Roux?
We're just anxious to see the mayor's budget proposal and see how well it aligns with some of the things we discovered in this report.
Amy?
I just want to thank you for covering our work. I would encourage everyone, keep asking the questions,
no doubt.
Become informed, participate in the discussion, and require a demonstration of efficiency toward effective outcomes.
A look back to plan ahead, analyzing the past New Orleans budgets to guide funding priorities. The BGR. One more time, where can I get a copy of the report?
BGR.org.
Guys, thank you all. Y'all promise to come back and share in the future.
We'll be back.
I'll be less frustrating the next time you guys come back, man. But y'all do a good job of trying to help us figure this stuff out. Guys, remember, man, there are a lot of challenges in front of us, ahead of us, behind us. Some are not your doing. But if you're looking in the mirror, right, and you have some issues and obstacles to deal with, don't wait for somebody else to come fix it. If you're only looking at yourself, you might want to start working on it yourself. Have a wonderful day.